3, 2, 1.
But here's my issue with the argument that we're not important, is then it makes it very outrageous for God to burn someone forever. Basically, our deeds, our actions, then having such a dramatic effect in the spiritual realm.
But then the question becomes like, is that dramatic, right? Like if I create like a table and then I like break the table, would you say that I did something wrong?
I actually don't know.
Because like the table belongs to me. I can do whatever I want with the table, right?
But I've struggled with this one. Can you though? Like, what makes it justified for? And this was something I had a question of a week ago. Like, what justifies us not being? We can't torture. Right? We definitely shouldn't torture. That's one of the most horrific things. But God can torture. Like, how's that okay?
Can God torture?
He does. Well, yeah, he tells us that he will torture.
Like, how would you define torture? Torture would be like the unjust punishment of like another human being, right? And then it's like, does God ever unjustly like punish someone, right?
Yeah, but if you say that we're not important, then burning someone forever seems like an unjust punishment for their unimportant actions.
There are a lot of ways one can go about this, right? One idea is that like everyone always like doesn't live up to what God kind of like asks of them, right? Like we can never repay Allah for like what He's done for us, right? Like even the Prophet Muhammad, he says like no one will enter heaven except by the mercy of Allah. And they say even you, Rasulullah, even you, O Messenger of God, and he says even me, right? So anyone who is in heaven is not there as a result of their deeds.
It's not deserving to.
Yeah, but they are there as a result of like the mercy of God, right? And it's like this idea that Allah is like the most compassionate, like the most merciful. The question of like why people go to hell is like also an interesting one, right? Because it has the conundrum of like, if I engage in finite actions, why would I go to hell like eternally, right? So like let's say I don't pray for like 5 years, and I don't repent for that. I would go to hell, right? Assuming that like God doesn't like forgive me, right? But like the beliefs of like most Orthodox Muslims is that finite actions don't carry finite actions have finite punishments, right? So the Prophet Muhammad, he said that he says that whoever says La ilaha illallah enters Jannah, right? So the way that
there is no God but one God.
Yeah.
Allah.
Whoever asserts kind of like the oneness of Allah and the Prophet Muhammad, or whoever is the Prophet in their times, enters Jannah, right? So everyone who doesn't worship other than God like enters heaven, right? But there are some people who might have that like right theology, but their actions don't match up to that theology, and they might go to hell for like a very very long time, but they will eventually enter heaven, right? So as Muslims, like we agree with this idea that finite actions only carry a finite punishment, but it's beliefs that carry an infinite punishment, right? And beliefs are not something that are finite. If I believe in 3 gods, I will believe that whether I'm on earth for 1 day or 1,000 days or 100,000 days, right? I'll believe that whether I'm here for 70 years or like 7 million years.
So what causes the true infinite punishment is the infinite crime of belief that God doesn't exist, or of belief that there's multiple gods.
Yeah.
Oh, and that kind of resembles a thought I had the other day, which is what makes this life the determinant of whether we're good or bad. Like, I feel like we should have multiple lives then. And there's nothing that in Islam that goes against, there being this idea of multiple realities. Like, there's this reality, but there's multiple realities with like certain glitches. Like, rather than I have this mic, you have that mic instead, and Ozzy's sitting over there rather than over here. Certain stuff like that. And what I came to the conclusion of was, or at least my hypothesis is, this life is a conclusion of infinite lifetimes of examples of what you would decide. If you in this life became Muslim, that means at least one out of the infinite realities you have, you became Muslim. And if you didn't become Muslim in this life, that means 0 out of the infinite realities you've ever existed in, you've decided to become Muslim. It's kind of like how I've thought about it. Like, this life represents infinite realities you would live, and in all of those infinite realities, you either became Muslim once or more, or never ever became Muslim, and this one represents that.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Did that make sense?
This is something also Rumi talks about, where Rumi says that Allah doesn't oppress a single person, right? So he says that the people in hell are actually better off in hell than they would be in heaven. And this is something that's like kind of like mind-boggling, right? It's like, why would someone be better off in hell than in heaven, right? But Rumi says that in the same way, like, if I eat like let's say I eat fast food all the time. If you were to give me like a healthy meal, like, the healthy meal is technically like what is good and what is better for me, right? But I'm not gonna want that because I'm just used to like, you know, like fast food all the time, right? So he says like the people in hell, the reason they're not able to enter heaven is because they are not like spiritually well enough to understand the greatness of heaven. And he says that like, although hell is like a bad place, they're actually better off in hell than they are in heaven.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And that kind of goes with what Ozzy was saying, is that God expects your soul to be matured enough through those characteristics that he laid out to you. He's like, this is how I am. These are my characteristics. Strive to be like this. You will never be. Strive to be like this. And just your striving will get your soul matured enough, maybe.
Yeah.
You know, through that logic for heaven.
And this is also another thing that's very interesting, that in the Quran it says that the people who commit shirk, when they pass away, we're not allowed to ask Allah to have mercy upon them, right? If Allah has mercy upon them, that's like Allah's decision. But like, someone can't disobey God and then we ask Allah to like forgive them, because like that's not our right. But what we can ask Allah is to deal with them justly, right? And Rumi continues on to say that the people in hell, they'll eventually feel satisfied by like the infinite justice of Allah. And Allah also says, my mercy encompasses all things, right? So other kind of scholars like Ibn Arabi, who's like a very kind of famous like Andalusian scholar, he says that even like the people, like hell will eventually kind of like look like heaven, because like the people there will experience like the mercy of God. Which is like a more like minority kind of opinion. But I think it's like a really interesting thing to like think about, right? That even those in hell, like they are there by the kind of compassion and justice of God in kind of this roundabout way.
Interesting, because they're still not being punished with the worst punishment of all, which is non-existence. Like, they're still allowed to, they're existing. Interesting. It kind of reminds me of this part in, I think it's in Surah Al-Mu'minun or Al-A'raf. I think it's Mu'minun actually, where someone dies, towards the end of Surah Al-Mu'minun, where someone dies that is a disbeliever, and he goes, Rabbi Ruj'un, God, please allow me to return, and I will do good. And God says, no, this is only words, mere words that he says, right? And that's what made me say the very thing that I said earlier, which is, why is that fake? Maybe he would return this time or this reality and change. But through what God is kind of saying is like, they would never, the ones who decided not to be Muslim, in this life, it's because they would never, ever be Muslim, or which is really being Muslims, believing in God, right, or one God. So that's so weird, man. You're saying a lot of trippy stuff about hell, and one thing that's trippy about it is sometimes in some parts of the Quran, God goes and they will be in heaven forever, and as for the disbelievers, they will be in hell. But he doesn't say forever afterwards. There's
actually one verse where it says "Khalidina fiha abada."
It does. Yeah.
It says they'll be in hell forever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But then and that's what I meant, is like in some verses.
Yeah.
So some verses it says forever, in some verses it doesn't say forever.
Yeah.
What do you think what's going on there?
I mean, I think it's pretty clear, like Quranically, like there will be people who will be in hell and then eventually get to heaven. Yeah.
And then there's those that'll be there forever.
Yeah.
Do you have something for us, Hans?
What I think is cool is, like, as humans, you know, when we think of hell, we probably think of, like, the worst place possible. But, like, going back to what you mentioned, like, Allah never oppresses anyone. So it's like, I would rather get a punishment from Allah than from, like, a cop, let's say. Because I feel like his punishment would be a lot more fair and just to whatever my situation is than, like, a human.
We were talking about this the other day, right? Where it's
like
I trust God to be just over me more than I trust myself to be just over me.
Yeah.
It's also the question of like, what does it mean to be like a disbeliever? Like in Arabic, like the word for disbelief is like kufr, right? Is everyone who doesn't take the shahada considered like a disbeliever? So like Ghazali actually writes about this, where he has like categories of people that he believes are like Allah says in the Quran, like, we don't punish a people without sending them a messenger, right? So Ghazali says that if someone doesn't receive the message, like they just get amnesty and they go straight to Jannah. So he says that like if someone lives in a land where they don't know what Islam is, they don't know anything, he says that they would just get amnesty and they would just go straight to Jannah. And he talks about like Christians who like live in like the era of the Crusades in like one of the faraway Christian lands, and they don't have access to kind of like all they hear about Islam are like kind of like bad propaganda and that sort of stuff. Ghazali says like they would also be good to go. And basically like people, and Ghazali also gives the example of someone who they hear about the Prophet Muhammad and they hear that he's like a good man and all this sort of stuff, but they don't actually have access to the Quran. He says that they would also be excused. And it's a question of today with the supply. Because one could easily say, like, today we have the internet, right? So everyone has, like, you know, access to, like, a lifetime of resources about Islam. So does one today have that responsibility to, like, search for that meaning and learn and do all these sorts of things? Or, like, will Allah say to them on the Day of Judgment, like, you had the internet, like, you could have, like, you know, accessed all of these sorts of things?
Sheikh Google.
Yeah. So would Allah like place that on people, and like anyone who doesn't take the shahada today, who has like, you know, who's not like, you know, living like, you know, off the grid, you know, somewhere, would they have that like responsibility, or would they also be excused just by like this opinion of like Abu Hamzah al-Ghazali?
Very coincidentally, not coincidentally, God hides through coincidence. That, you know, technology evolved and now we have a lot of messengers, a lot of things that bring out the message.
Yeah.
So would the internet be today's messengers?
Yeah.
Well, stuff, not like that,
But the way I kind of like reconcile this is like regardless of the answer, Allah tells us that like He deals with everyone justly, right? So like whatever the answer to kind of like the question is of like who is like given salvation and who is not, we know that Allah will deal with them justly.
And you know what's interesting is the definition of kufr proves what we're saying. The definition of kufr comes from originally the word for kufr in Arabic is from a farmer who hides a seed deep in the ground, who buries a seed deep in the ground. Like in one part in the Quran, God refers to farmers as kafara. You're like, that's interesting. Why would he use the same word for disbelievers as he is for farmers? Well, it's actually because he's not talking about any farmer. He's talking about a farmer in the very beginning stages of planting a seed deep in the ground. So kuffar is actually people who just hide the truth deep inside them. It's actually people who know deep inside that Islam's the truth. They look at Muslims and they're like, oh, this Islam's bad. But you have a conversation with them, it touches them, and they're like, ooh, and then they hide it deeper. And that's one of the biggest things I noticed with non-Muslims that I talk to about Islam. At some point, they're touched. At some point, the door for hidayah, like the door for belief or faith, opens, and you can tell the moment they consciously close it back for themselves.
Mhm.
And they go, no. Never is this religion correct, and they hide it deeper inside them.
Mhm.
And that's interesting. It's like a kafir is not someone who doesn't know the truth. Someone who knows the truth and hides it deep
Yeah,
inside
someone who
them.
covers it. Yeah.
Yeah.